Historians, this is Mrs. Tyler. Today we are doing Unit 2, Notes 4. This is the War of 1812, and this will take us probably 2 days to get through in class, so it could possibly take 2 of these videos to finish up both sides of our notes packet on this topic. All right, so we've been talking about how overseas, as our country was just starting out, Britain and France had been at war on and off for quite a long time. Okay? It's the early 1800s. Great Britain and France have been at war on and off for over 50 years. By 1803, the leader of France, Napoleon Bonaparte, is on a quest to overpower most of Europe. Britain has the world's most powerful navy and a very strong army, but Napoleon is very determined. There's Napoleon. He says, "Vive la France!" Okay. Growing tensions with Britain around here. Britain was still irritated that the U.S. had won the War for Independence, the Revolutionary War, in 1781. So it's been over 20 years. Britain still owns all of Canada, and they want to reclaim some of the lands in the interior parts of North America, especially that area in the Northwest Territory and parts of like the Ohio River Valley. All of those were important to them. It was very sought after land. The U.S. economy relies on trading goods with both France and Britain, but France doesn't want the United States to trade with Britain. Britain doesn't want the United States to trade with France. The first 3 presidents have had to negotiate with both countries to protect U.S. interests. We're going to skip that today. Okay, so we're going to talk about the 3 main causes of the War of 1812. The first one has to do with shipping. The second has to do with something called impressment. And the third has to do with support of Native Americans. So let's talk about shipping. When the United States wouldn't stop trading with France, the British Navy began attacking U.S. merchant ships headed for France. U.S. ships in the Atlantic Ocean and throughout the Great Lakes were at risk from British attacks. The British Navy was the largest and most powerful navy in the world. So I want you to write down in your notes that under shipping, the British Navy was attacking U.S. ships headed to trade with France. Okay. Impressment is not about impressing somebody with your skills, but in this case, it has to do with kidnapping. The British Navy would stop our ships and board them, and then they would accuse the sailors on U.S. ships of being British. British basically who fled England, and then they would say that they had the right to recapture them and force them to serve in the British Navy as punishment for fleeing. This wasn't the case always, okay? The British Navy was kidnapping U.S. sailors. Okay, we call that impressment, okay? As settlers moved into the Ohio and the Mississippi River valleys, many American Indian nations were pushed off of their lands. The U.S. discovered that Britain was stirring up trouble among the Indians in the Northwest. The British hoped that helping the Indians would scare off American settlers and ultimately give Britain control of the interior part of the continent. So under Native support, will you please write that the British helped the Indians resist U.S. settlers in the Northwest? Oh, we need to. Okay. There we go. Let's talk about the Battle of Tippecanoe. This is Tecumseh that you see here. He's an American Indian. Okay. 2 Shawnee Indians, a chief named Tecumseh and his brother, the Prophet, tried to unite the many different Indian tribes into one confederacy of natives. Okay, supplied with weapons that Britain had given them. They led warriors in attacks on settlements at Tippecanoe Creek in Indiana in November of 1811. Indiana's governor at the time, William Henry Harrison, led a militia to put down the uprising. So for Tecumseh, would you please define him as the Shawnee chief who led Indian resistance to U.S. settlement? And then on the timeline, would you write down Britain helped the Indians fight the U.S. at the Battle of Tippecanoe? So there's a debate over what to do at this point. We've got three really strong reasons why the United States isn't really very thrilled. All these tensions rising between the United States and Great Britain. Shipping rights, the impressment of sailors, and then them supplying Native Americans with weapons and encouraging them to attack U.S. settlers in the Western territories. So we talked about the spectrum of foreign policy based on the early presidents. We talked about isolationism and wanting to kind of keep to ourselves and not get involved in other parts of the world. So there are people on that end of the spectrum at this time period who want us to just stay out of it and try to keep peace at all costs. And then there are the war hawks who are looking for a reason to make sure that Britain and other countries know that we shouldn't be messed with. Okay? So many Americans were fed up with the British, but not all citizens were interested in going to war. American trade relied on doing business with Britain and France. Merchants up in New England didn't want to jeopardize their business with Britain. Their part of the economy relied on continuing trade with Britain, and they knew that if we went to war with Great Britain, that could hurt their income and their earning potential. Others felt that it was time the United States stood up for ourselves in matters of foreign affairs, and some of them hoped that not only could we establish a don't mess with us kind of attitude and basically tell the rest of the world that we've kind of grown up and we're not just that silly little country that, you know, Britain will eventually take back. There were also people who were hoping that we could gain even more lands and kick the British out of parts of Canada. So we were hoping that we could regain, or not regain, but gain even more land. So isolationists are hoping that we can keep trading with Britain, and they felt that the odds were against our new little country. They were saying pretty much, you know, we're less than 40 years old as a country. We are just finally getting out of debt, and we are just finally being able to start up our own navy and things like that. I don't think that we're ready to take on the British again. It was kind of sheer luck that we won the Revolutionary War. Others are saying, hey, we need to make the frontier safe for U.S. settlers. We need to add Canada to the United States, and above all, we need to protect our shipping rights. Ultimately, this can't happen with anybody if we can't trade with who we decide to trade. So President Madison, our fourth president, we remember him as being the father of the Constitution, and at this point he's been elected as president of the United States. President James Madison was hesitant to go to war. He wondered if the country was strong enough to take on the powerful British. They have the most powerful navy in the world, and at the time our navy, the U.S. Navy, only had about 20 ships. The British had over 1,000, so it's kind of a scary situation to go into. But Britain was also fighting Napoleon in Europe at the time. So their attention was going to be divided. They're going to still have to fight Napoleon in France and on mainland Europe. And then they would also have to divert some of their attention and focus on the United States. So some people, especially the war hawks, were saying if there's ever going to be a time to declare war on Britain, it's right now while they are already fighting another country. Madison became the first U.S. president to go to Congress and ask Congress to declare war. So this is remarkably different than the foreign policy of the first three presidents that tried to stay isolationist, at least to the best of their ability, especially George Washington. This time we actually have a president going and asking Congress to declare war on another country. So would you write down for James Madison that he asked Congress to declare war on Britain? And in your timeline for the year 1812, would you please write down that the United States declared war on Great Britain? I'm going to skip this. All right. Battles at sea. So there's a couple of different places where the battles of the War of 1812 take place. In 1812 to 1813, most of the battles are going to take place at sea, mainly in the Atlantic Ocean and also in the Great Lakes between the United States and Canada, because remember, Canada is controlled by Great Britain, and so they're going to already have British troops there. And so a lot of what's going to happen It's going to happen not just in the Atlantic Ocean between where Britain is and the United States, but also between Canada and the United States on the Great Lakes. The United States saw a few victories on Lake Erie, but even with Britain dividing their military, fighting France and the US, our victories were difficult and pretty rare. The United States and Britain fought nearly 40 naval battles in the Atlantic and the Great Lakes. Would you write down the following facts for the War of 1812 battles at sea? Early in the war, most battles were fought at sea. Nearly 40 naval battles were fought in the Atlantic and the Great Lakes. There were also battles on the frontier. The U.S. thought that they could simply conquer Canada by marching right in, but they were wrong. Each time the United States forces crossed into Canada, the British forced them back. There were a few victories for the United States on the Battle of Lake Erie and the Battle of the Thames. Shawnee Chief Tecumseh was fighting on the side of the British. We just talked about him. He had had the attack on settlers at the Battle of Tippecanoe the year in 1811. He is fighting on the side of the British at this time at the Battle of the Thames. He died there in 1813. So the United States was unsuccessful every time we tried to invade Canada. Some of the Indians fought on the side of the British. This is going to have lasting impact. The fact that Tecumseh dies during this, he was working very hard to unite all the different Native American tribes to fight against and resist U.S. settlement. And so with him being dead at this point, the Native Americans are not going to have that strong leadership to try to unite them. So that's going to impact things in the future. Okay, some of the other battles that happened on land. In 1814, the British defeated Napoleon in France, and they turned their full military force on the United States. Troops were sent into Canada, and they also attacked military forts in Baltimore. The British Army invaded Washington, D.C., burned several public buildings, including the White House. President James Madison and his wife Dolly had to flee for their lives. So for battles on land, Britain attacked military forts along the coast. The British invaded Washington, D.C. They set fire to the White House. And also, you're going to write down that there's important victories at the Battle at Fort McHenry and also New Orleans, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. At the Battle of Fort McHenry, while the British attacked Fort McHenry outside of Baltimore, American lawyer Francis Scott Key watched the battle from a ship in the harbor. He watched through the night, and when dawn broke, he was thrilled to see the U.S. flag waved over the fort. He wrote a poem to express his feelings, and it later became our national anthem. So would you write down that Francis Scott Key wrote our national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner? He wrote the words for it. Okay? Here is one of the flags from the battle of, that's the flag, the Star-Spangled Banner, that the poem by Francis Scott Key was actually written about, and this is on display at the Smithsonian Museum. So there it is. Okay. The Treaty of Ghent. A British fleet had surrendered to the U.S. forces at the Battle of Lake Champlain in New York just 2 days before the unsuccessful attack on Fort McHenry in Baltimore. The U.S. had failed to push the British from Canada. They were embarrassed by the invasion of Washington, D.C. So things are not going well for the British. They're having to surrender. The United States is embarrassed because the British came in and tried to burn down our nation's capital. Not our capital, but the White House. Both sides are ready to end the war. The Treaty of Ghent was signed December of 1814. However, news is slow. It's not like they could just text message and, hey, war's over, here's the treaty to prove it. It took weeks and weeks to get that news back to the United States and back to our military. So battles continued in spite of this peace treaty. Would you write down in your notes about the Treaty of Ghent that it was signed December of 1814, and it formally ends the war, but because news is slow to travel, there's going to be some battles after the fact, and nobody really wins or loses the War of 1812. The United States had been trying to kick Britain out of Canada. We were unsuccessful with that. Britain was trying to reclaim lands here in the United States, and they were unsuccessful in that. So nobody's goals were actually achieved. However, there were some results of the war that were important. Would you please put in your timeline that 1814 is when the Treaty of Ghent was signed, and it formally ended the War of 1812.